Hello, everyone. Harmon Smith here, and today I have some Sony fanboy bullshit to I would like to expose to you all today because this is absolutely one of the big reason, I would say, if not the only reason, I have become so antagonistic towards PlayStation fans over the last couple of years because of their crazy, ridiculous hot takes regarding gaming history and gaming culture as a whole. And I don't think I'm the only one who's been noticing this. I probably take it a bit more seriously than most people, to the point where I can't even take PlayStation fans seriously at all anymore because they're so clearly blinded by their fanboyism for a company. It's really interesting what this article in and of itself is very interesting for a lot of reasons, but more interesting, well, maybe not more interesting, but just as interesting is the response to it. And I do think it says a lot about the Sony fanboy mindset is just where their minds go when they read this passage from this very specific from this very specific article. So yeah, let's get right into it and read this. This Polygon article about Square Enix is insane. Nintendo banned Square from their offices for 10 years after Final Fantasy VII went to PlayStation. Square spent the entire decade trying to crush Nintendo and ensure that Sony won. Not just the entire decade. They're still doing this today. But it's kind of interesting how we're reaching the point where people are outright talking about this. This is not something that people really acknowledge, that Square was actively trying to ruin Nintendo. Like this narrative that oh, they switched over to PlayStation because of the cartridges, that's complete crap. They would have just come right back once GameCube went to disc, but that didn't happen. It just Square is definitely one of the most PlayStation biased developers out there, and it really does show in how they talk about things and how they handle certain situations and what they talk about in their investors meetings. Shinshiro Kachina, Vice President, Square, USA. When we made the decision to go with Sony, for about 10 years, we basically weren't allowed into Nintendo's offices. From a consumer's point of view, it was good to have two companies competing with each other because prices wouldn't rise and it would be better for them. That's a load of crap. But from a business perspective, our main interest was making sure that Sony won and Nintendo lost, basically, because that would be better for us. So yeah, completely delusional. Antagonistically, it's so interesting how these people will always push this narrative outright in this one statement. Oh, it's good to have competition in the industry. It's good to have multiple platforms. And then they turn around and say that oh, we're only going to support Nintendo. We're only going to support Sony, and Nintendo can go fuck itself. It's so interesting. They would be very happy. It is actively their plan, their agenda to straight up ruin Nintendo and drive them out of the console industry. And that's been the goal for the past 20 years, right? Since PlayStation was incepted, is to take all the third-party games and put all the development resources, all the money, all the talent, and put them on PlayStation and try to make the biggest games in the industry from all these different people on PlayStation. And to trick the public into thinking that the PlayStation is some higher end platform for mature games for mature gamers, essentially. That's always been the plan, and it just never worked out. Of course, the Nintendo handhelds kept doing well, the consoles kept doing well. The Wii did great, outperforming the PS3, even with all of this bullshit kind of taking center stage. It's phenomenal to see how well Nintendo has handled this onslaught by all these multi-million-dollar corporations. Nintendo is basically entirely on their own, and yet they're still destroying it. It's phenomenal. They've done as well as they have over the past couple of years. And okay. First of all, this PlayStation thing was a mistake because Squaresoft did go bankrupt due to being PlayStation exclusive. They went bankrupt not even 5 years after Final Fantasy VII. Due to the movie, it's commonly associated with the movie, but if you think about it, they became too ambitious. They put too much money into making these high-end, cinematically driven RPGs rather than just putting out a bunch of really high-quality ones like they did during the 90s. Like, you know, how they put out stuff like Secret of Evermore, stuff like that. Like, nothing they made. They fell into the problem that developers are having today, in which they are putting too much money into a product that's not making enough back, and that's why we're seeing like Final Fantasy 15 not doing so hot. Like Final Fantasy 7R is probably only going to sell like I don't know how much it's going to sell, but it's not going to be enough. Like they want this to be like this. They probably want each episode to sell like 10 million units, and I can guarantee you that's not going to happen. This project is going to lose a lot of enthusiasm as the years go on, and people are expected to wait for like episode 2, 3, 4, 5 potentially. It's going to be. It's already been a disaster. It's just a matter of the disaster being public knowledge. It's interesting how people spin this to be a negative against Nintendo and not a negative against Square or against Sony, because it really just goes to show you the maliciousness that Sony has for their competition, and the links that Square Enix will go to fuck them over, to fuck Nintendo over in favor of their PlayStation overlords. And it is the PlayStation overlords, like the Xbox and PC ports. That's mostly to make their money back, because they know that they can't only survive on PlayStation hardware. There simply isn't enough interest on that platform alone. They have to milk their consumer base dry any way they can. So they have to go to other platforms. They have to do this timed exclusive shit. They have to just try and make the money back they wasted developing for these expensive to develop for PlayStation consoles. It's so incredible how people will make this narrative that like and say that like, oh, cartridges were too hard and too expensive to make, and then turn around and justify supporting the PS3. You know what I mean? Supporting the PS3 at all, or supporting modern PlayStation at all, when it's too expensive and it would be more practical to just take a step back and make bravely default games for Nintendo consoles, like that kind of RPG, like the kind of RPG that Square used to make. But instead, they're chasing this elusive demographic of the PlayStation audience that will blindly defend anything you do. And that's who this tweet was targeted at, apparently, because like I said, Mike Vita for Life, really interesting. Really interesting username there, Mike. Vita. Yeah, the Vita sure is having a great life cycle right now, isn't it? Surely the most full of life handheld platform out there right now. You know, the Vita's doing really, really well, I've been hearing. Wish they did a better job at crushing them. The world would be a better with Nintendo as a third-party developer. Yep. Yeah, so Vita fans, it's always the Vita fans with the weird takes. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good response to that. Like that's how people are looking at this. Like seeing this as a thing, Nintendo being antagonistic towards Square when Square actively tried to fuck them over, and Nintendo responded to that and punished them for that. But the issue here is that Sony is basically keeping all of these developers alive on life support, right? You have like all this you have like these timed exclusivity money, you have this marketing money, you have this like treating these big these third party IPs like they're big PlayStation mainstays. It's like appealing to these people, right? And they go to extreme lengths to sort of defend PlayStation, and the world would be a better place with Nintendo as a third-party console. Like, they always do this shit. They always talk about how great it is to have, like, competition and stuff like that, but then they turn around and say, like, oh, Nintendo needs to go. Just, like, there's no honesty there. It's disingenuous. They just hate Nintendo and need to justify Sony existing and doing the things they do. They're called informed, educated, and coming from experience. Almost like Nintendo fans are exclusively children and 30-year-olds who haven't played video games since the 64 being milked for nostalgia. Wow, I'm pretty sure I play more video games than you do. I own more video games on the Switch than you own on the Vita, or have even been released on the Vita. Like that's how severe the quality difference is between Nintendo and PlayStation right now. It's very it's interesting how these people will like hype up shit like the PlayStation Vita while simultaneously shitting on like Nintendo consoles. It's unreal. Like these people are downright obsessed with hating Nintendo. Best decision they ever made. Yeah, so good. They made Final Fantasy VIII and then started declining almost immediately. Like less new IPs, more cinematics, more story driven, less quality, less focus. There were a handful of good games after that. Like, Final Fantasy IX is fine, right? But there was a very clear decline after the PlayStation era, right? Where the game started being worse and worse. They started being unfinished in the case of Xenosaga and Final Fantasy VIII, I would argue. Xenogears, I would say. Yeah, Xenosaga is Namco Bandai. What am I talking about? Mistreating developers, similar to Konami. Just look at how Sakaguchi was fired. Sony fanboys always paint this Final Fantasy VII exclusivity thing as a very, very good thing for Square that really freed them up creatively. But I always see it as a bad thing because Square has been making worse games since then, and that's very, very clear if you've actually been following and looking at what they've been doing over the past several years. It's so interesting how so many of their Super Nintendo games are like considered some of the best ever, and since then it's been nothing but a very slow decline, right? Like PS1 was worse than the Super Nintendo, PS2 was worse than the PS1, PS3 was worse than the PS2. As the talent like moves on and does other things, they keep making worse and worse decisions, and we're at the point now where they're straight up ruining their own classic IPs with Final Fantasy VII-R. How is this a good decision? Like, how was this a good decision? Like, Nintendo dominated over the past several years. They outright ripped the world's most popular RPG away from Enix, right? They established Pokemon as the head of the JRPG market. Like, the industry doesn't want to admit that, similar to how they don't want to admit that Breath of the Wild is the best open world game ever made, or that like Nintendo has a strong library of great first party IPs. They just refuse to admit it. Nintendo did some crappy things back in the day. Like what? Like, name a single thing that's as terrible as what Sony pulled with this re-release. Like with Shenmue 3, right? That one thing, right? Having Yu Suzuki come up on stage and hype up a Kickstarter. You know what I mean? Like, name a single thing that was as terrible as that. Like, you can't come up with shit other than this propaganda that like cartridges were somehow holding back video games, which was never true. Nintendo can't do wrong, according to their fans, Lamio. Yeah, that's not even true. Like, these people project so much. Oh yeah, I heard about this years ago. A lot of devs left Nintendo for Sony during that time. Not only were the games hard to make and expensive due to those old cartridges, but they hated working Nintendo's strict policies. Sony pretty much let devs do what they wanted, and the quality went down. As I've been pointing out, like all these strict policies, those were for quality control. Those were implemented to prevent developers from doing the sort of shit they were doing in the Atari age, where they were like making porn games, making games that were literally unfinishable. Like, that was what Nintendo was trying to do, like implement some degree of quality control on the market. Like that was what Nintendo did, and it was an overall benefit to the industry. And that's been Sony's policy till this date. Remember, Guerrilla Games wasn't trained to make games like Horizon Zero Dawn, but Sony allowed to give a shot. What? Are you implying that Nintendo doesn't like let developers make open world games? Like, Sony allowed Naughty Dog to change and become revolutionary by Uncharted Drake's Fortune. Devs under Sony appreciate this too. How was Uncharted revolutionary? Uncharted was the biggest risk Naughty Dog took. It was one of the first games to have that amount of linear story. Uncharted, Drake's Fortune, gave a new direction to Naughty Dog and saved PS3 from being a complete flop. Like, late the likes of UC2, Infamous strengthened its position. So these completely retarded takes that don't make any sense. Uncharted is not that good of a game. Has anybody else called them out on this? Like, it's amazing. Microsoft is another offender. Bungie changed the way Reach played because they were trying out ideas for their new upcoming project, Destiny. They didn't want to make Halo anymore, but the suit said no, so they had a falling out, and then they're Scalebound. Though now you have Sony fans, didn't they cancel that new IP from the God of War developers? Funny how you don't see these people bring that up. Unreal, just embarrassing. Like I said, like I'm not exaggerating when I talk like all this shit about Sony fanboys and the shit they pull and the shit they say, the shit talk they say, not just for Nintendo, but for PC and Xbox fans too. Is just trying to make out Sony to be the video game equivalent of Jesus Christ. Like that is literally how they view Sony. Like Sony is their savior. They saved us from the satanic Nintendo and brought a new age of prosperity and light to the PlayStation audience. In reality, it's more like North Korea. Like when you get right down to it, like these are a bunch of people who are basically indoctrinated to love a video game company that has basically done nothing for them, and and they will religiously defend and get legitimately upset when things don't go well for them, like with Horizon Zero Dawn going to PC. It's the damage control. Yep. Glad. Imagine a gaming world with the only option being trash Xbox and a kid-friendly Nintendo. Go from Sea of Thieves, Grounded, Battletoads, and then Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, and offshoots of all those. Lol. Yeah, again, they legitimately do. These guys are legitimately repeating talking points from like 10, 15 years ago that weren't even true then. That Nintendo only like makes Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon games when Animal Crossing has blown up. Like Fire Emblem has blown up. Kid Icarus Uprising is one of the best rail shooters of the past decade, if not the best rail shooter. You know, rebuilding new old IPs like Star Fox Zero. Like there is so much that Nintendo delivers. New IPs like Splatoon and ARMS. There is so much that Nintendo delivers on a yearly basis. It's so frustrating to see these people seriously come out and demonize Nintendo for how they handled the Square Enix situation, in which Sony came up to Square, gave them money to make Final Fantasy VII PlayStation exclusive, and then they desperately tried to justify why that had to happen to everyone, including themselves. It's really no different than what they're doing today with the episodic nature of Final Fantasy VII-R. The difference, I think, is that people are a bit more aware these days. They're a bit more skeptical. I think I mentioned earlier in my last video that like people weren't really talking about Final Fantasy VII-R being as bad as it was, but that's not really true because I am able to come out here. I am able to have a voice. I'm able to point this shit out and point out these logical inconsistencies, these fabrications, these narratives, notice things, point things out. Square is never ever again going to be able to pretend that Nintendo somehow fucked them over. Like the only reason this narrative has continued so long is because of corrupt game journalists pushing this narrative onto a entire generation of gamers that don't really want to accept that history might not actually be true. Like who don't want to admit that there's something up with Square Enix, and who don't want to admit that things have been getting worse over the past decade. It's the past few decades. It's very, very interesting. But I think at the end of the day, Nintendo is reaching the point where Sony can't really do anything against them. Like back in the 90s, it was basically just paying off all the biggest third party developers to ignore Nintendo and only support PlayStation. And they still do that today with Monster Hunter World and things like that. But Monster Hunter World and Final Fantasy VII are, but it's not the huge blow against Nintendo it used to be. Like you get your Final Fantasy VII R, and we get our Animal Crossing New Horizons. Like who really loses in that situation? Like the biggest games you've gotten this year so far have been a remake and another remake, and a game so similar to the last one that it might as well be a remake in Doom Eternal, in which, meanwhile, New Horizons is a completely new thing, and we have new games on the way. And again, Xenoblade Definitive Edition, I'm not a Xenoblade fan, but Xenoblade Definitive Edition does look like it's going to be a better remake than Final Fantasy VII R. It looks like it might make radical improvements to the original game. It's adding additional content, and it's not doing so in a way that's going to take away from the original game. You know what I mean? Like they're taking the original game, remaking it, and then adding out additional content, presumably to tie it better into Xenoblade Chronicles 2. That's my take on it. And I think they're going to do a reasonably good job. That's not really going to alienate their core fan base at all. It's going to be way better than what Square has been doing with Final Fantasy VII R. And that's something I want to leave off on, is that Nintendo fans are way more critical of Nintendo than they need to be, while PlayStation are way more affectionate or obsessive or willing to accept bullshit than they ought to be. Like they're complete opposites in a way. And the PlayStation fanboys, they're basically the gaming equivalent of simps. Like it doesn't matter what PlayStation gives them, anything at all, as long as it's like has that hype behind it, as long as it has that like Sony PlayStation stamp of approval on it, like they're gonna get excited, because that has all they've ever done throughout their entire lives. Talk about pathetic.